week I will be discussing the risk management process that we learn about in Chapter 1 and Chapter 10, and also talk about how the process could have been used to yield a different outcome for UPS Flight 1354. So, kind of the background of the accident. During a night flight to Alabama, low ceilings were reported, and a NOTAM was published stating that runway 0624 would be closed at the time of the aircraft's arrival. This meant that the only option they would have to land there would be on the shorter runway with no precision approach. So, on the way to their destination, the first officer loaded the approach into the FMC incorrectly, which ultimately resulted in the aircraft not meeting the proper altitudes along the approach. This resulted in too much of a sink rate, and eventually a sink rate alert was heard on the cockpit recorder, and the cockpit recorder also recorded what sounded like the airplane meeting some trees just prior to the too low terrain alert. So, step 1 of the risk management process discussed in Chapter 1 of the textbook is to identify the hazard. In this case, the crew, along with the flight dispatcher, should have identified that the weather would require an instrument approach opposed to a visual approach, and then they should also have identified that the ideal runway would be closed and only a non-precision approach would be available. Step 2 of the risk management process is to assess the risk. At this point, an assessment of the weather should have been made to determine if the weather was good enough to continue the planned flight and if the runway and approach available would be sufficient for landing, just because it wasn't going to be a shorter runway with a non-precision approach. Chapter 1 of the textbook also discussed the PAVE checklist, and at this point, using the PAVE checklist would have been a great idea, especially the environment part of the acronym that entails both weather and NOTAMs, because that ultimately was two key factors in this accident. So, mitigating the risk is the third and arguably the most important step of the risk management process. Each flight has its own set of risks, but being able to find ways to mitigate these risks will help achieve the desired result of a successful flight. In the case of the UPS 1354 accident, the non-ideal weather and runway situation is a risk that could have been mitigated had the proper steps been taken. The first thing that could have been done once the decision to go ahead and make the flight is for the two pilots to brief the approach to the runway that they would need and ensure that the flight plan programmed into the FMC mirrored their expected route. Communicating and double checking prior to shooting the approach likely would have yielded a different result than what ultimately happened on this flight.